goes up to 8,000.
Okay, how about 6 to 8?
42 Quebec, roger, descend and maintain 7,000. You can expect that block in about 5 minutes.
Okay, and you still want us on 070, or can we work within the area?
42 Quebec, upon reaching 7,000, you can proceed directly infill.
Roger.
As we're coming down, I'm going to bring the condition levers to low idle. The N1 did not change. Low idle is asking for an idle speed in the low 50% range, but up here the air is so thin that even with the fuel flow as low as it can go on the fuel control unit, we're idling in the high 60% range. As we continue the descent, you may be able to observe, and will observe, that the N1's going lower because of the fact the air is getting thicker and it's harder to maintain that N1 speed and that thicker air. So this is a case where the fuel control unit, being an N1 governor, can't govern. Just like prop governors can't always do it, here's a case where we can't always do it because we've been overridden by the minimum fuel flow setting in the fuel control unit. Yeah, it looks like the clouds are going to dissipate here in a little bit. Notice our rate of descent has been quite high. And again, the pitch attitude appears to be slightly below 10 degrees to get this to happen. Now, you may be wondering why we didn't go to full flaps to get more drag. Well, yes, we get more drag coefficient by extending full flaps, but we'd have to slow down into the white arc area to do that, and at the slower speed, we actually would not have any more drag. Out of the clouds. I'm turning off the ice protection items and the reverse path how I turned them on before. And as I get this last 8,000 or 8,000 for 7,000 feet, I'm bringing the nose up. I'm coming into the low magic number of power. Now, you newcomers haven't heard that phrase yet. You'll get more of it later. But in this airplane, that low magic number is about 300. It's at about 300. As I start leveling off, the speed's dissipating. I have to get below 130 knots before I can bring up the gear. Might as well get the flaps up now, holding my hand on the handle until I verify the action. Now I am below 130.
The traffic that was a factor at earlier is no longer a factor. You are cleared to air work. And are you able to maintain a certain distance from the VOR since the VOR is out of service?
Yes, ma'am. We have GPS. We can do that. And in fact, we are in VMC condition at this time. If you give us a block, fine. We can do that, or we can just cancel IFR.
42 Quebec, I can give you a block if you'd like, and you're cleared to do air work within a 15-mile radius of the Mansfield VOR. Maintain block altitude 6 through 8, and just advising you through.
Very good. Within 15 miles, any radial of the VOR, and a block between 6 to 8 for 42 Quebec.
42 Quebec, that's correct.
All right, I brought the props back. Turn prop sync back on. Level off, and I'm going to now accelerate and maintain 160 knots. I'll do some slow flight. Let's see, the bearing to the station is 174. We're 7 miles away. We're allowed 15. We're in good position here, orientation-wise. When the power comes low enough, we'll get a gear horn. That should trigger somewhere around 79% in this model, King Air, higher than some other models. So as they come back, I'll let you listen to the gear horn blowing here, perhaps. Not sure if it'll show up in the video. And that should come on when the N1 gets right about here. Now, as long as the flaps are up, I can reach over and silence it. I've come to my low power setting in this airplane, about 300 foot-pounds of torque. I know that will get me down to the slow flight I want to do, and I want to target for 90 knots here. I just turned off the yaw damper by pushing the red disconnect button on the control yoke. It'll let me feel the airplane a bit better in terms of P factor and yaw tendencies it may have as it gets slow. As it's slowing, I'm gradually trimming and bringing the nose up higher to compensate for the loss of airspeed with a bigger angle of attack. And as in most airplanes, at this slowest speed, we'll actually get in the area of the backside of the power curve, a region of reverse command, where it's probably going to take a bit more power to fly slower than it is to fly faster because of so much induced drag. Airspeed's coming through about 117. As the nose gets higher and higher, the airspeed will decrease a bit faster. Be prepared for that as the induced drag gets even greater. We have about 20 knots to go. About 15 knots to go.
7,000, no speed restriction, and join the localizer southwest.
About 10 more.
808.
Now there's the ongoing debate of is it pitch or power that controls airspeed or altitude. As we all know, it's a combination of both. I still find it easier for myself to think in slow flight that the primary control of airspeed is pitch. The primary control of altitude is power. So as I saw the airplane tending to go down a bit, I added power up to about 400 foot-pounds of torque. I'm adjusting pitch and pitch trim to try to have it hold about 90 knots, hands off. Trying to keep the scan going outside for any traffic, and it's one reason I like, if possible, to do this with a air traffic control monitoring us and keeping their out for other traffic nearby as well. Let's do a 90-degree left turn. Let's clear ourselves to the left, roll into a gentle turn at 90 knots. It's only going to take maybe 12 degrees of bank or so to get a standard rate turn. The slower you go, the less bank required, of course. So a nice gentle turn, and coming from 230 till 140. The horn you're hearing, perhaps in the background, and the light you may be able to see here on the panel, although it might be hidden by the glare shield, are the stall indications for this model King Air. It should come on about 10% above stall. And I'm ready for the rollout here, a slight power reduction as we reach the new heading.
045, Cleveland approaches request.
It's requiring a bit more right rudder now than it was in level flight because of the high angle of attack of propellers.
Are you already?
The little power I've added has brought us above the level where the horn is blowing. And in this model King Air, as in many others, if we lower any flaps whatsoever, we cannot silence the gear horn. I'm not going to lower the first notch of flaps. Keeping my hand on the handle until the indicator indicates what I want to see. Initially, there's a bit of ballooning tendency there, and for a while we'll think the airspeed probably won't change much. But if we're patient, that extra drag will start slowing us down, and the target I'm going for now is 80 knots. So just being patient, seeing if it's going to require another power change. Time to look around. Engine instruments are fine. Our pressurization is gone since we had the cabin up there at 8. We descended under it. I wanted to show you that there's no way the cabin will ever be above the aircraft. That would represent negative differential. That can't happen. So we're in a dumped condition at this point. With the low power setting, sometimes it's hard to maintain pressurization, and that's one reason quite often for this. We'll go ahead and have the cabin high and have either low or no differential pressure. It looks like the airplane's kind of stagnated at 90 knots, so slight bit power reduction, and see if we can get down to 80. As we're waiting, it's interesting to hear the answers we get when we ask people the question of what will happen to the rate of descent if we lower the landing gear. Well, there's no real answer to that question unless we specify something else, and that is what airspeed we're at. Because the landing gear, and there's the stall horn again, its drag depends on airspeed of the airplane. And certainly at slow speed, there's less drag than at high speed. So now we're finally have reached the 80 knots. The induced drag is such I've had to add a little bit of power to stay there to keep the altitude. In fact, a bit more. I'm up to about 460 or so on the torque. Looks like I'm not correcting much. Let's go to about 500 and see if that brings the altitude up. And let's push a little right rudder in here to stay on heading. So back to my point about the gear. At a typical ILS approach speed, around 120 knots, the difference between gear up and gear down may be a difference of 500-600 feet per minute rate of descent. On the other hand, an emergency descent, 156, is probably well worth more than 1,000 feet per minute rate of descent. And finally, 80 knots, it's not worth much at all. So watch when I put the gear down now. Hold the gear handle until I verify it's down. 3 green, no red. Good reminder to turn off the sync. I'll turn on the taxi light, let people see us who might be out here. And I haven't changed power now, and I'm just going to keep trying to hold 80 knots here. I was getting a little sloppy. Let me pitch up to do that. And for all practical purposes, you'll find the performance didn't change a bit. That the drag of the gear is almost a non-event at 80 knots. Now, besides being just kind of curious information, what does that really tell you? Well, one thing I hope it drags home is the need in the bulk landing right over the runway with a full dirty airplane unexpected go-around. Don't be in a hurry to get the gear up. The flaps are more drag than gear. That gear comes up last. It's not hurting you too much at slow speeds. Let's go to full flaps. Select full, hold my hand on the handle until I verify they're down. There they are. I'm going to go for 70 knots airspeed. The airplane gets quite squirrely in pitch as we get this slow, especially the conventional tail king airs. Also, it's quite common we will run out of nose up trim depending on the center of gravity load in the airplane. I'm coming up on 70. I'll anticipate a bit more power to hold it there. There's the stall horn and light. What I want to now demonstrate before we do a stall is a discussion about propellers. When we use the term being on the governors, it's a situation in which the propeller is maintaining the speed we've selected. Now, a long time ago, I selected 1900 when I came out of the emergency descent. The props are still basically at that speed. If I run the propeller controls forward, sure enough, they respond, telling me there was a lot of flattening of the blade angle that could occur during this time. If I come back, the RPM decreases, the blade takes a bigger bite. So definitely the propeller blade angle is on that governing range. But at 60 or 70 knots, there's not much wind against the prop. And if I reduce power, with reduction of power and reduction of wind, the props will not be able to maintain governing speed. Before I reduce power, I'm going to add power quickly. As the torque comes up, watch the props. You'll see a slight increase followed by a reduction. The response time for the governor to increase the blade bite. Let's do it opposite. Let's reduce power. We see a reduction in speed and a recovery as the propeller flattened out. But now as I reduce power far enough, I'm going to start a descent now. There'll be a time the propellers cannot recover RPM. They're off the governors. There it is, right there. That's a fixed pitch propeller. If I reduce power more, we see the propellers, no response here. Whatever I do with the prop control, no effect. If I lower the nose, however, and increase airspeed, the propellers will windmill faster, just as a toy pinwheel coming out the window of a car. If I bring the nose up, level off, they'll windmill slower. That's a fixed pitch propeller. That's a condition that has to be met before we can go into beta and reverse. With the propeller power levers at idle and low idle set, there's a tremendous lag in engine response. Watch this as I firewall the throttles to the wall. If I hadn't pulled that right one back then, it would have over-torqued. And also you notice the two engines did not come up at the same pace. That's a very common event in these airplanes. So because it's so easy to get ahead of the engines and not know what torque and temperature will result if we slam too fast, and also because it's common that one engine may come in before the other and give us a bit of a yaw concern, we teach that when you add power for the stall from an idle condition, we go about a third of the way up, let the power catch, then we finish. So let's do an approach to stall here at 6,000 feet with idle power. All the way back, and when I get the first buffet, I'll go ahead and recover. There it is, about a third. I hesitate, 1, 2, 3 seconds. Now, finish, watch torques and temps. Power coming up, right on up, watching temps. There's coming up in 1200, 700. Props full forward for maximum efficiency of the props. Now you notice I've held the nose slightly above the horizon, almost level, and the airspeed's now in the green arc, where I shouldn't stall with the flaps coming up. So I bring the flaps all the way up in one motion. I let the nose pitch up to about 10 degrees and hold it there. Coming back and rechecking my power, slightly over on the temps. Now, as I keep holding that 10 degrees, the airplane did not slow down. Here's a positive rate. It starts climbing. The gear can come up, and I'm going to climb back on up to 7,000 feet. With full flaps in the conventional tail airplanes, when we retract the flaps, the nose wants to come up of its own accord. So we do a little bit of pulling to get it to 10 degrees, and then we do a lot of pushing to hold it there, keep from going too steep. up. That tendency is not as great in the T-tailed king airs. That was a good demonstration, too, of a slight lag, and that's one reason we stop at 700, since there is a margin there that exists if it goes a little over, which wouldn't exist if we went right to red lines in that situation. So the sluggish power response is a phenomenon when we're all the way back at idle. But rarely, except for the last bit of a flare for landing, would we ever have to be at idle power. The lowest number we typically use is about 300 foot-pounds. So let's redo that stall with the 300 foot-pound setting, and showing it this time, we'll be able to fly right out of it without worrying about that sluggish response. I'm coming back to 300 foot-pounds. The gear is 3 green, no red. The flaps are down. By the way, myself and many other pilots tend to put the flap handle back in the center when the flaps are down. It's not a requirement, just an idea. In the later king airs that you do that in the C90Bs, the 350s, or the 1993 and after B200s, and the flaps will come back to approach. But in this situation, no, they stay down. We got to go up to get the flaps retracting. All right, in this case, with 300 foot-pounds set approximately, I'm just going to hold 7,000 feet, wait for the first buffet, and try to fly right out at 7,000 feet. There's the buffet, power up. Watching my instruments, both flight and engine. Now the props up.
42 Foxtrot Lima, any turbulence during descent?
Oops, a little more right rudder, stand heading.
No, it's a pretty good ride now.
And the airspeed now looks like it's entering the green arc. Flaps coming up all the way. Pitching up about 10 to make sure we don't lose altitude. Trimming. Well, I've relaxed now and turned on the autopilot flight director, which is flying our heading at 330, 7,000 feet. And that 500 foot-pounds of torque has yielded about 130 knots. This would be appropriate for a holding pattern, assuming we don't have ice collecting on the wings in a King Air C90. Clean, 500 foot-pounds, about 130. Speeds for holdings in King Air are anywhere from about 130 to 160. The maximum legal speed for this propeller-driven aircraft, recall, is 175 knots. And one reason I'm down here slow is because I'm now going to go into an engine shutdown situation and talk about the engine failure procedure. So an intentional shutdown, where I would use a condition lever to feather an engine or shut it down and then use the prop control to feather, is a bit different than some unexpected power loss. I'm going to simulate this is that case of some unexpected power loss. I hate to say engine failure, because sometimes the power loss is nothing more than a friction knob getting so loose, I'm not sure if I can demonstrate this, that the lever sometimes scoops back on its own. So don't always think that a loss of power necessarily is an indication that the engine really has died and will have to be shut down. The procedure always starts with 4 items as we fly the airplane: power, props, flaps, and gear. And in the earlier King Airs with the gear handle on the co-pilot side, of course that lends itself superbly to a very easy flow pattern from left to right. Later King Airs have the gear handle on the pilot side. There's one exception to the flow, but still quite easy to do. In a piston airplane, we had to get mixtures and props up before throttles, or we could hurt the engine. That's not the case in the PT6. So when you suspect the power loss, go for what you want. Go for the power. But know that all your power and efficiency is not really there until the props come up, which can sometimes lead into a retuning even of more power. Another point is that this particular C90 model does not have the optional propeller auto feather system, a wonderful, wonderful system. And if we had that system, if there truly is an engine failure and our response is to start with both power levers up, we will trigger auto feather and the problem will be taken care of. The prop will be feathered long before we could do it manually. Will the autopilot fly well through an engine failure? The answer is yes, in most cases. It's a great cockpit aid, and certainly it should be monitored. We should be prepared to turn it off if it's not doing a good job. But as long as it is, why work hard? Let it do the thing. So what I'm about to do is take my left condition lever and cut off the fuel to the left engine and then I'll pretend that I'm sitting up here without that expectation, but simply in a holding pattern type airspeed, and leave the autopilot engaged and go through the procedure. Here we go. As a little safety measure, I'll take the other condition lever a bit farther. That's just something we do in a flight training scenario, so there's a bit less chance the other engine would ever get cut off. Here we go. Well, I feel a problem. So power, I'm about 500 foot-pounds of torque. I'm doubling the power up to about 1,000. Checking temps are fine. I'm pushing right rudder. Both prop levers, full forward. Let's verify the flaps are where we want them, up, and the gear is. Now there's a lot of right rudder required now for me to keep it straight. The left foot's dead. The left torque is dead. The left generator light's on. I'm sure it's the left engine, or I think so. So to verify, I'm going to pull this lever back and there's no response. I'll take that same size prop lever and feather it. Now I can let up on that rudder quite a bit, not all of it. Now let's trim the rudder a bit to the side I'm pushing, to the right. Now even at that very slow, deliberate pace, which is a good pace to use, even starting at 130, we never got below 110 knots. In this airplane at this weight, blue line is about 101 knots. Let's continue having a bit more rudder trim here to get the ball close to center. Remember that when we're trying to maximize single engine performance, we don't want the ball dead into the center. We want it slightly out towards the good engine side and carrying the dead engine slightly high. But let me say again, that's when you want to get the last little ounce of performance out of it. If you're just flying level or in a descent, you don't need that last ounce of climb performance. And if you prefer to fly wings level, ball centered, it's simply a matter of giving enough control input, either by your foot or trim, for that to happen. So as we did that, the airspeed's picking up again. Now I'll go to our emergency procedure, go to the one for engine failure in flight, and verify that the memory steps have been done. First step, power levers as required. I doubled the torque. That's an excellent guideline. Double the torque if you can. If you can't, because you run into your torque limit first or an IT limit, then simply go to climb power type settings. If you need it all the way to the wall, you can do that. But most cases, double existing torque will keep about the same performance. The prop levers I shoved forward, the flaps and gear I'd considered. I verified the engine and feathered it. A comment about the verification. After I brought the throttle back, I brought it forward. The reason for that is the throttle switch triggered the gear horn and the lights in the handle. If I leave it back, I can silence the horn. But now I never quite know if the gear is all the way up because the lights stay on. So that's why we suggest you either take that dead throttle beside the other one or just push it all the way up out of the way. Now we know exactly where the gear is. Now for the cleanup items. And some of these steps may already have been done. The condition lever is in cutoff. The propeller lever is verified in the feather position, especially for those people with auto feather. The fuel firewall valve. Now as I turn and face the fuel panel to my left, out of your view, I've got to make sure I keep my left-right orientation and close the left firewall valve. The boost pump and transfer pump on the left side, they go to the off position. The crossfeed switch is closed. The generator switch gets turned off. Engine auto ignition switch we verify is off. The fuel control heat for that side is off. Prop sync is off. Now my electrical load, the generator is carrying about 60 amps. This particular model has digital ammeters and well below the 250 amp limit. And I check voltage, and the single right generator is supplying roughly 28 volts to both meters, which means my electrical system is continuous. I have not had a current limiter failure. And it's time to turn back towards the VOR. Let's clear to the left and make a left turn. I'm choosing to go toward the dead engine to show you the ridiculousness about a concern about turning towards the dead engine. With the autopilot flying, with the rudder trim having been halfway done, with the speed blue line or above, the airplane doesn't tell whether it turns toward the dead engine or towards the good engine. It does just fine either case. And now I'll open the checklist to page Alpha 3, and this particular checklist to be prepared for my single engine landing approach demonstration, which is to come. In the turn, we've dropped off the speed about 125. Before I started that, we were back up to 130. Unlike piston airplanes, where the relationship between manifold pressure is not linear with power, but in the turboprop it is. Torque for a constant prop speed is directly proportional to power. So when I began the engine failure by doubling torque, the torque came down a bit when I brought the props up. That's why I have closer to 900 now instead of 1,000. But you see how the performance stayed, for all practical purposes, identical, right about 130 knots in that situation. Now, if I lower approach flaps to simulate getting ready for a single-engine approach, after the initial ballooning and the time for response, the airplane should come out to fly at about 120 knots with this power setting. For standard operating procedures and practices, for a single-engine, non-precision instrument approach, let's be realistic. How often would you do that in real life? If you lost an engine, you go to a visual airport, or one with a nice big long wide ILS runway. You sure wouldn't be doing a non-precision approach unless that was about the only choice available within a reasonable range. So having said that, for standard practices, we must force ourselves to remember to keep the gear up until we see the runway for the single engine approach that does not have a glide path. It's impossible in this airplane to fly level single engine once the gear is extended and maintain a safe airspeed. And we cannot pump the gear up. We can only pump it down. So that's why we hold off on the gear till we see that landing runway and know the landing is assured. On the other hand, if we have a visual check of the runway or an ILS glide slope that's directing it to us, sure, we can put it down at the normal place, no problem. I'm going to flip off the autopilot now and simulate that we're going to do an approach down to 6,000 feet for an MDA. I've just crossed the final fix. The torque is coming back to approximately 300 foot-pounds, and as I do that, I have to push some left rudder and take out some of that right rudder trim. And now, this 300 foot-pounds should approximately give us about 1,000 feet a minute descent at 120 knots. I was a bit slow in getting the nose over, lost a bit of speed, so we'll try to pick that up here by putting the nose down a bit steeper. And here we're simulating the single-engine, non-precision approach with the magic number of torque about 300 foot-pounds. Now, you people flying King Air 200s or 300s, 100s, your magic numbers will be a bit different than these. But once you learn them, the high number that gives you the 160, the low number that gives you approach speed in a 1,000 feet a minute descent, the middle number that gives you typical ILS, descent, approach speed, approach configuration, you can sure use those in a lot of ways, and the airplane pretty much flies itself. I've been a bit sloppy in the speed, but as you can see with the speed proper, the descent rate's getting proper here. And to level off at 6,000, about 100 feet above, let's bring the torque back in towards that 900 foot-pound figure. And staying on top of the rudders. And since the flight director is in view, once I get there, I'll go ahead and push the altitude hold button. I have the flight director bars helping me out for that. Remember, in a non-precision approach, MDA is exactly what it says, minimum descent altitude. We shouldn't be a foot below that. So it's always better to level off just a touch high rather than be dropping low on the MDAs.
Mansfield approach 4 to Quebec. Can we extend that block down to 4 to 6 for a little bit?
4 to Quebec, I got 4,000 traffic underneath you. You can make it 5 to 7, and I'll keep you advised.
That'd be just great. 5 to 7 sounds good.
All right, now let's pretend we did have a glide slope that just centered for us, and we're ready to start down for the single-engine ILS. The gear comes down. Three green, no red. And with no change in power, the drag of the gear at 120 knots should start us into about a 500-600 feet per minute descent, the typical 3-degree type profile. Also, the nose is not much below the horizon typically on this. A little bit, yes, maybe, but it's almost a level attitude descent. Let's check the abnormal checklist for the single-engine landing. The propeller lever is full forward and a good engine. The cabin sign would come on if we were really making a landing with passengers. The flaps are approach. And because we're simulating that we're in a position to continue down the glide path to a suitable runway, we've gone ahead and lowered the gear at this time. We've checked it's down. We've turned our landing taxi lights on. The pressurization is checked down to low or no differential, in this case none. And then only if we were absolutely going to commit ourselves to land with no go-around potential would we then go to full flaps. In the most runway situations, we just land with approach flaps. The runway's long enough. Keeps it simpler. My speed's good. Descent rate's a little bit less. Let's try 800 foot-pounds of torque. I'm going to pretend the runway is at 5,000, and 200 feet above it is our decision altitude of 5,200. Unlike MDA's, decision altitudes can be busted as long as we're in the procedure of going around and not continuing the approach to landing. So if we haven't met the criteria to make that normal landing and see the runway environment, we have to make the decision at decision altitude and then execute the go-around. So I'm standing by for that another 150 feet. Still a bit shallow on the descent rate. 100 feet to go. Pretending we're still in the clouds. Getting ready for the go-around. I'll still use the 700, 1200 limits here. Go-around button has been depressed. Up comes the power. Before I lose my momentum, flaps up, and with a positive rate, gear up. Looking for about 101 knots. In many, many King Airs, the key now is to hold a pitch attitude of about 7 degrees, which is what the go-around command bars should be set for. There's some model of aircraft where the difference in climb performance can be quite noticeable just with a 5-knot difference in airspeed. The King Air wing doesn't seem to be quite that critical, so even though the number I'm now going to target for is somewhere around that 101, probably any number from 95 to 110 is not going to give us too much of a sustained different climb situation here. Well, the airplane has gained 300 feet. Our 4 friends, remember the left-right flow, power, prop, flap, gear? That's what I did here. Prop was already up. I just wanted to verify it. But that go-around was that same left-to-right flow. Now, since I'm trying to maximize performance, I want to think about that ball, having it just favor the right side of the case, having a very slight bank to the good engine to the right, and we'll be leveling off at 6,000 feet. Again, will the autopilot fly a single engine go-around? Yes, indeed. I've just turned it on. It's holding the attitude. I'll keep after my rudder force and do a bit rudder trimming if needed, which I'll definitely have to take some trim out as I level off. But the autopilot's doing a fine job. That gives me a chance to see if I forgot anything in the go-around. Power max allowable, prop forward, flaps up, gear up, airspeed to blue line, and return to the normal after takeoff checklist. That's always a good reminder to remember that anytime we've missed an approach, we've started a new flight. So back to the normal after takeoff, gear, see, lights. That's an excellent one that we tend to forget when we're busy there. That's why the checklist is so important to follow up on.
No, the 5 to 7 will be just great.
And flaps are up. The yaw damper I'm going to have on because the autopilot's on. If it were hand flying single engine, I'd probably leave the yaw damper off at this time. Prop full forward, and let's see. Now that we're picking up some speed single engine, let's kind of compromise. Let's go to the climb setting at 2,000 RPM. I think we'll have no trouble at all of flying level single engine with that setting and make it a bit quieter. Prop sync I'll leave off, then we're single engine. The bleed air, we'll leave it on the good engine. Maybe flip it off for the bad one. Pressurization is still non-existent because of our cabin altitude setting. Cabin sign switches off. Outside check still fine. Now, obviously, if an engine failed for real, we probably wouldn't be starting it in flight. There's something major wrong with the engine. But for training purposes, if we shut it down as we have, or if we have shut one down for a precautionary reason, perhaps a loss of oil pressure, and then the other engine totally blew up, we might want to get that other one restarted again. So I'm now going to go to the Airstart starter assist, abnormal procedure, to restart the left engine while the autopilot flies. Step 1, cabin temp mode selector off. Vent blower switch in auto. The radar standby are off. The windshield heat switch is off. For the affected engine, the left engine, the power lever is coming to idle, and we're silencing the warning horn. The propeller lever is still in feather. The condition lever is still in cutoff. The fuel firewall valve now going open. The boost pump and transfer pump switches are turned on, and that extinguished the fuel pressure light. The crossfeed switch to the auto